Okay, so today we're going to be looking into a topic that might be a little bit, I don't know, tougher than usual, but it's definitely an important one. We're going to be kind of exploring the animal kingdom
Okay.
through a different lens today, focusing on creatures whose circumstances often bring up feelings of sadness in us humans.
You're right. It's really easy
Wow.
to kind of project our own emotions onto animals when we see them
Sure.
behaving in ways that seem, sad or distressed to us.
Hmm.
But of course, we can't just ask them how they're feeling. We
Right.
could just interview them.
Right.
But we can look for clues in their
That's
actions,
sure.
especially those that might
Yeah,
indicate that they're not thriving.
exactly. It's all about understanding those behaviors and what they might tell us
Right.
about an animal's well-being. And you mentioned behaviors,
Yeah.
and I think a great place to start would be with orcas. I mean,
Oh,
everyone pictures them as these powerful, majestic creatures.
right.
You know? But what happens when you take an animal that's evolved to swim vast distances and confine it to a tank?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast to their natural lives
Yeah.
in the wild. You think about it, in the wild, orcas can travel hundreds of miles a day,
Wow.
hunting,
Yeah.
exploring, and socializing with their pods, these
Uh-huh.
incredibly close-knit family groups. They even communicate
Oh,
using these complex vocalizations, almost like dialects unique to each pod.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
So you're saying that being captured doesn't just limit their physical space, but
Right.
also their social interactions and even their ability to communicate in the way they're used to.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes the whole idea of captivity even more disturbing.
It really does.
Yeah.
And tragically,
Yeah.
it often leads to behavioral changes that are really hard to ignore.
Yeah.
We see captive orcas exhibiting signs of, depression, self-harm,
Wow.
and even aggression towards their trainers. It's like their spirit is broken.
That makes me wonder about the long-term psychological
Right.
effects of captivity
Yeah.
on these incredibly intelligent creatures. It's like
Hmm.
taking a human
Hmm.
who's used to a rich social life,
Right.
a stimulating job,
Yeah.
and the freedom to travel and locking them in
Mm.
solitary confinement.
That's a really
Yeah.
powerful analogy.
Yeah.
And it really highlights just how devastating captivity can be
Right.
for these animals.
Right.
It's not just about physical space. It's about
Yeah.
depriving them of the mental and social stimulation
Totally.
that's
Yeah.
so crucial to their well-being.
It's a stark reminder that we need to carefully consider the needs of these animals before we confine them
Right.
for our own entertainment. It's not enough to just provide food and water.
No.
We have to consider their
Same.
psychological well-being too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of needing space to roam, let's move on to another animal
Okay.
that often suffers in captivity.
Mm-hmm.
The polar bear. I mean, these are creatures that are
Yeah.
perfectly adapted to
Yeah.
life in the Arctic, navigating vast frozen landscapes and hunting seals on the ice.
And zoos, despite their best efforts,
Yeah.
simply can't replicate that environment.
Yeah.
Polar bears in captivity often display, disturbing behaviors,
Yeah.
like pacing endlessly back and forth or obsessively
Now.
bobbing their heads.
So what we're seeing are essentially coping mechanisms
Right.
for animals that are
Yeah.
deeply bored and
Yeah.
understimulated.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to find any outlet
Right.
for their pent-up energy and frustration.
Exactly. It's a tragic mismatch between their natural instincts
Right.
and the limited environment they're forced to live in.
Yeah.
Imagine having the urge to run for miles, to feel the wind in your fur,
Wow.
to hunt and explore, but being stuck in a small enclosure with nothing to do.
It's heartbreaking to imagine.
It is.
And it makes you question whether
Yeah.
we as humans have the right to confine these majestic creatures for our own amusement.
Yeah.
But, it's not just zoos where animals suffer.
Right.
We also have to talk about factory farms, a topic that's
Yeah.
difficult but impossible to ignore when discussing animal welfare.
You're right. It's a reality that millions of animals, pigs, chickens, cows,
Yeah.
are raised in incredibly cramped and unsanitary conditions.
And often denied even the most basic freedoms.
Absolutely.
Space to move around,
Yeah.
the chance to socialize,
Yeah.
even access to fresh air and sunlight.
It's a system that really prioritizes profit over animal well-being,
Yeah.
treating them as commodities rather than
Yeah.
living, feeling beings.
You mentioned the scale of the suffering earlier, and it's a problem directly tied to our food choices.
Right.
What are the implications of our demand for cheap meat?
It's a complex issue.
Sure.
On one hand, we have to recognize that factory farming has made meat more affordable and accessible to more people.
I see.
On the other hand,
Yeah.
the ethical cost of this efficiency is immense.
Yeah, so it becomes a question of values.
Right.
Are we willing to accept this level of suffering
Yeah.
for the sake of convenience and affordability? Are there more sustainable, humane alternatives? These are questions we all need to grapple with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the answers aren't always easy.
Right.
But simply asking the questions
Sure.
is a crucial first step towards becoming more conscious consumers.
For sure.
Now, you brought up the cramped conditions of factory farms, but how does that affect the animals themselves? What kinds of behaviors do we see as a result of this intensive confinement?
Just like the orcas and polar bears we discussed,
Yeah.
factory-farmed animals
Yeah.
exhibit many signs of distress.
For sure.
They might engage in repetitive behaviors like bar biting
Right.
or tail chewing, or even resort to self-mutilation out of frustration.
Those behaviors are clear indicators of chronic stress and an inability to express their natural instincts.
For sure.
Pigs, for example, are highly intelligent and social animals.
Interesting.
But in factory farms, they're often confined to tiny pens
Oh, wow.
where they can barely move.
And it's not just pigs.
Right.
Chickens are often kept in cages so small they can't even spread their wings.
Right.
Cows are routinely separated from their calves shortly after birth, a practice that causes immense distress for both mother and offspring.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that these animals are sentient beings, capable of experiencing a wide range of emotions, just like we do.
It's a heavy truth to confront.
It is.
And it brings us to another intelligent and social animal that faces immense challenges in captivity.
Yeah.
Elephants. I think most people know that elephants are highly social animals, living in complex family groups, led by matriarchs.
Yes.
The oldest and wisest females.
Exactly. And those family bonds are incredibly strong, lasting a lifetime in captivity.
Yeah.
Elephants are often separated from their families,
Oh, wow.
which can lead to intense grief and loneliness.
Yeah.
Imagine being ripped away from your loved ones and forced to live in a completely unfamiliar environment.
That's a devastating thought.
It is.
And on top of that, they're often confined to spaces that are far too small for them to roam and explore as they would in the wild.
Right. And that restriction of movement, combined with the social isolation, can lead to a range of behavioral problems. We see captive elephants exhibiting repetitive swaying, head bobbing, a general lethargy, and sometimes even aggression.
So what we're seeing is essentially a form of grieving.
Yeah. They're mourning the loss of their freedom, their families, their entire way of life.
Like PTSD almost.
It's a profound loss.
Yeah.
And it's reflected in their behaviors.
Yeah.
They're carrying a heavy emotional burden.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another example of how captivity can fail to meet the complex needs of these amazing creatures. And it highlights the need to consider the ethical implications of keeping such intelligent and social animals in confined spaces.
Right.
But unfortunately, the ethical complexities don't stop there. Our next topic takes us even deeper into the challenging territory of how humans interact with animals, chimpanzees, in research labs.
This is a topic that raises difficult questions
about
our relationship with other species.
For sure.
Chimpanzees share about 98.7% of their DNA with humans. They're incredibly intelligent, capable of problem solving, tool use, and complex emotions.
Right.
Yet we've subjected them to some truly horrific experiments.
It's definitely a dark chapter in our history.
Yeah.
And the chimpanzees used in these labs display clear signs of distress.
They do.
They exhibit depression, self-mutilation, aggression, and other behaviors that indicate profound suffering.
It's a stark reminder that despite our intelligence and capacity for empathy, we can still inflict immense cruelty on other species.
Yeah, it's a challenging issue to grapple with.
It is.
But we can't turn away from it.
No.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about a problem that's closer to home for many of us, abandoned and stray dogs.
Yeah, I think most people have a soft spot for dogs.
Right.
We see them as loyal companions, full of love and affection.
But for a dog living on the streets, life is a constant struggle.
It's a harsh reality.
Yeah.
Stray dogs face hunger, loneliness, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of danger.
Right.
They might be hit by cars, abused by humans,
wow,
or attacked by other animals.
It's a far cry from the pampered lives
Right.
many pet dogs enjoy.
Yeah, and their behavior reflects that hardship.
Yeah.
You see dogs cowering in fear, whimpering, showing signs of anxiety and distrust.
Yeah, they've lost their faith in humans, which is particularly sad, given how much dogs crave connection.
It really highlights the impact our actions can have on the animals around us.
For sure.
Choosing to adopt rather than shop for a pet can literally save a life.
Right.
And even simple acts of kindness towards strays, like offering food and water, can make a difference.
It's about recognizing their vulnerability and showing compassion.
It is.
And that brings us to another sensitive topic, one that's often difficult to discuss, but essential to address: animals being transported to slaughter.
It's a reality we can't ignore.
No.
And while we can't know for certain what's going through an animal's mind in those final moments, we can observe behaviors that suggest fear and distress. They often vocalize loudly, attempt to escape, and display other signs of anxiety.
It's as if they sense that something terrible is about to happen, which is a terrifying thought.
It is.
And it raises a lot of ethical questions about how we treat animals, even those raised for food.
It does. It forces us to consider our responsibility to minimize suffering, even in situations where death is inevitable.
Yeah, these are complex issues with no easy answers.
Right. Yeah.
You're right. And those ethical questions become even more complex when we consider the impact of habitat loss on animals. This issue is connected to broader environmental concerns like deforestation, pollution, and climate change.
All of which are deeply relevant to our lives as well.
Absolutely. As we encroach on their natural habitats, animals are displaced. Their food sources become scarce. And they're often forced into closer contact with humans.
And that leads to conflict.
Which can lead to conflict, exactly.
It disrupts their entire way of life.
It does.
And as with the other situations we've discussed, this displacement leads to changes in their behavior.
It does.
They might become disoriented, lethargic, less social, or even exhibit aggression as they struggle to survive in a shrinking world.
It's a clear sign that they're struggling to adapt to a world that's rapidly changing around them, a world where their needs are often overlooked.
And it's a reminder that our actions have far-reaching consequences for the entire ecosystem.
Absolutely.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, let's touch on one more.
Heartbreaking situation that can cause distress in animals. Separation from their young.
Yeah, this is something that resonates deeply with us as humans.
Of course.
Because the parent-child bond is so powerful across species.
It is. And we see very similar reactions in the animal kingdom when that bond is broken. Mothers who are separated from their young often exhibit very clear signs of anxiety and distress.
Exactly.
They might vocalize loudly, search frantically for their offspring, and show changes in their appetite and sleep patterns.
It's a primal instinct to protect their young. And when they're unable to do that, it causes them immense suffering. It's a feeling of helplessness and despair that I think we can all relate to on some level.
We can.
It highlights the depth of their emotional lives and the importance of considering their feelings in our interactions with them.
Well said.
Thank you.
And now let's shift our focus to another creature that often faces a life far different from what nature intended. Birds kept in small cages. I mean, these are creatures born to fly, to soar through the sky, to explore vast distances. Yeah,
you see these vibrant creatures designed for flight, confined to a space where they can barely even spread their wings. It's a stark contrast to the freedom they're meant to experience.
You know, it's like taking an athlete who's trained for marathons and making them live in a tiny room. It just feels wrong. And it makes you wonder, what does that kind of confinement do to a bird's mental and physical well-being?
Well, imagine you're a bird whose instincts are telling you to fly to forage for food over vast distances, to socialize with a flock. In a cage, those instincts are completely stifled. they can't exercise their wings properly, and they're often deprived of mental stimulation and social interaction.
So it's not just about the physical limitations of the cage, but also the lack of opportunities to engage in natural behaviors. What kind of impact does that have on their behavior?
Sadly, we often see birds in small cages resorting to behaviors that suggest they're not coping well.
Like what?
Things like feather plucking, repetitive pacing back and forth, or even just a general lack of energy and enthusiasm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to find any outlet for their frustration and boredom.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking to think about. And it makes you wonder, why do we continue to keep birds in these conditions?
Yeah.
Is it simply a lack of awareness about their needs, or is there something more at play?
I think it's a complex issue. Some people might genuinely believe they're providing a safe and loving environment for their pet bird, not realizing the extent of its suffering. Others might prioritize the aesthetic appeal of having a colorful bird in their home without fully considering its well-being.
Yeah, it seems like education is key here. Right. We need to make sure people understand the responsibility that comes with keeping any animal, especially one whose needs are so easily overlooked. There's a big difference between admiring a bird's beauty in the wild and confining it to a cage for our own enjoyment.
I agree. It's about recognizing that animals are sentient beings with their own complex needs and desires, not just objects for our entertainment or decoration. And that brings us back to a theme we've touched on throughout this deep dive, empathy. As we've discussed these different examples of animal suffering, it's clear that on some level we can relate to their experiences of loss, fear, and confinement.
Right. We've all felt those emotions in our own lives. And even though we can't know exactly what an animal is feeling, we can use our own experiences to try to understand their perspective. You know, the way you described the mother separated from her young, it reminded me of this news report I saw about a dog who refused to leave the site of a car accident where her puppies had been killed. It was so heartbreaking.
That's a powerful example of the depth of their emotions. And it underscores the importance of recognizing that animals experience a wide range of feelings, just like we do.
Yeah.
It's not anthropomorphizing to acknowledge that.
Right.
It's simply recognizing their capacity for suffering and joy.
It's about respecting them as individuals with their own unique personalities and experiences. And that respect should guide our interactions with them.
Absolutely.
Whether it's advocating for better treatment of animals in captivity, making conscious choices about the products we buy, or simply being more mindful of the creatures we share this planet with.
I think the key takeaway here is that animal behaviors can provide valuable insights into their well-being. By paying attention to those behaviors and understanding what they might be telling us, we can become better advocates for animals and make more informed choices about how we interact with them.
So it's about moving beyond those initial feelings of sadness or pity. And using our knowledge to create positive change.
Right.
That's empowering.
It is. And it's not about feeling guilty or overwhelmed. It's about understanding that we all have a role to play in creating a more compassionate world for animals.
It sounds like you're saying even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Choosing to adopt a pet rather than buying one from a breeder can save a life. Opting for cruelty-free products whenever possible sends a message to companies that we care about animal welfare. And even something as simple as treating the animals we encounter in our daily lives with kindness and respect, those seemingly small acts can have a ripple effect.
It's about shifting our mindset from seeing animals as commodities or objects to recognizing them as fellow beings who deserve our compassion.
Precisely. And I think the most important thing is to never stop learning, never stop questioning, and never stop advocating for a more compassionate and just world for all beings.
Beautifully said. And it reminds me of something we discussed earlier about the impact of factory farming and the choices we make as consumers. Are there specific things listeners can do in their everyday lives to make more ethical choices about the food they eat?
Absolutely. It's empowering to remember that we have choices when it comes to these issues.
So where do we start? What are some tangible steps listeners can take when it comes to food and animal welfare?
One powerful step is reducing your consumption of animal products. You don't have to go vegan overnight, but even incorporating a few meatless meals into your week can have a significant impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like there's a growing movement towards plant-based eating.
Definitely.
You see more and more vegan and vegetarian options popping up in restaurants and grocery stores.
You do? It's becoming increasingly mainstream. And it's not just about ethics anymore. There's also a growing awareness of the environmental impact of animal agriculture.
Right, so it's a win-win situation.
It is.
You can reduce animal suffering and lessen your environmental footprint.
Exactly. And if you're not ready to give up meat altogether, You can focus on sourcing it from more ethical and sustainable farms.
So looking for labels like free range, grass-fed, or organic.
Those are good starting points.
Yeah.
It's about doing your research and supporting farmers who prioritize animal welfare.
And I imagine that farmers markets can be a good resource for connecting with local farmers and learning more about their practices.
They are. It's a great way to support local businesses and ensure that your food is coming from a source you trust. But beyond our food choices, there are so many other ways to get involved in animal welfare.
Like what? I'm really feeling inspired to take action.
Well, you can support organizations that are working to protect animals.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading awareness about their work.
And what about those of us who are passionate about specific animals, like the orcas or elephants we talked about earlier? Are there organizations dedicated to those species?
Absolutely. There are countless organizations working to protect endangered species, advocate for better treatment of animals in captivity, and promote responsible wildlife tourism.
So there's something for everyone.
There is.
No matter what your passion is. You can find a way to make a difference.
And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. Something as simple as educating yourself about the issues, talking to your friends and family, or sharing information on social media can plant seeds of change.
I love that. It's not about feeling overwhelmed or helpless. It's about recognizing that we all have the power to create positive change.
And never underestimate the power of your voice. You might think that one person can't make a difference, but collective action starts with individual choices and actions.
Well said. This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener. It's been a bit heavier than our usual deep dives, but it's also been incredibly empowering.
It has. It's been a journey of confronting difficult realities, but also discovering opportunities for hope in action.
It's a reminder that knowledge without action is incomplete. So I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us, and I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on this important deep dive.
It's been a privilege to be part of this conversation. Thank you for having me.
And to all our listeners, remember to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. The animal kingdom needs our voices and our actions. Let's make a difference together.